Okay, so King James, that King James, that King James, the one from the Bible, once got so spooked out by witches that he eventually researched and wrote a book on demonology. Meaning James, this great king of England and Scotland, the name tied to the Bible and the throne, is also the only Christian king in history to write a book on demons. And yes, you heard that right, demonology. It's bizarre, it's unexpected, and it's exactly why we're diving in. Because this isn't just a quirky footnote in history. It's a shadowy chapter of the Reformation, a grim slice of the 16th century, and a really haunting moment for Scotland itself. And at the heart of it stands King James. But back then, he was still King James VI of Scotland. But let's uncover what drove a king to write such a work, and how it fueled one of Scotland's darkest obsessions. To unravel the witch trials that gripped Scotland in the 1590s, we must begin with the man who stood at the epicenter, King James VI of Scotland. Born June 19, 1566, in Edinburgh Castle, James entered a world of chaos. His mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, was forced to abdicate just a year later in 1567, fleeing to England, leaving the infant James as king under a series of regents. His childhood was anything but stable, in other words, marked by a kidnapping at Stirling Castle in 1570, the assassination of his regent, the Earl of Moray, that same year, and the brutal murder of another regent, the Earl of Lennox, in 1571. Political intrigue swirled around James like the mists over the Highlands. Perhaps because of this, James grew up a wary, scholarly, and a kind of bookish man who was also very protective, in fact, fiercely protective, of his crown. You might say James' platform, to use a modern political idea, was three things: royal authority, Protestantism, and the eradication of any element in Scotland that threatened any of these two issues. In this case, it was witches. And James was going to destroy them. So by 1590, now in his mid-20s, King James of Scotland had emerged as a ruler of striking intellect. Fluent in Latin, he was a poet and a devout Protestant, steeped in the teachings of John Knox's Reformation. He was obsessed, in particular, with the doctrine of the divine right of kings, a belief he later articulated in the 1598 treatise, The True Laws of Free Monarchies. James is really one of the strongest to say that kings on this earth have no checks and balances. They can't be held accountable in this life, only in the life to come. God will get them in the end. That was always the idea. But you can't censure or remove a king from office. That's James' position. Also, because he's king, everything is going to be Protestant. Therefore, if you are a Catholic, or in this case, if you are part of the cabal of witches that are trying to destroy Scotland, well, James is going to come down with the force of the entire kingdom. The story begins with the betrothal of James and Anne of Denmark, a powerful connection to another Protestant nation, an important alliance in the percolating anger of what would soon become the wars of religion. For now, James was simply a young king waiting for his bride to arrive. Only she didn't. She was late. And then word came. Anne had boarded a ship for Scotland, and not once, but several times, the wind blew them off course and forced them back. Not to be a man short on chivalry, James decided he was going to mount an effort to go and fetch his new love. And he set sail in 1589 from the city of Leith. His destination was Elsinore Castle. Yes, that Elsinore Castle from Hamlet, where Anne awaited for her prince. The journey, though, was anything but smooth. Storms battered the fleet at the Orkney Islands, nearly claiming James's life, and when he finally returned back to Scotland on May 1st, 1590, with Anne finally in tow, docking in that same city of Leith, he was a changed man, convinced that dark forces were conspiring against his kingdom of Scotland and the Scottish people. You see, this is a bit of a mutation, you might say, of a previous problem. Denmark had already been gripped by witch hunts for some time. Influenced by others in Europe and the growing panic over diabolical conspiracies. James was impressionable, and he was surrounded now by Dutch scholars who began to argue that witchcraft was likely to blame for what was going on with Anne's disaster of a voyage. This wasn't just about the weather, they argued. It was about the survival of God's anointed king. And Scotland was no stranger to the fear of witches either. In fact, just 3 years prior to his birth in 1563, the Scottish Parliament passed the Witchcraft Act, a harsh law that declared witchcraft and even consulting with witches punishable by death. The ink had barely dried on this document when James even came into the world, but for decades, that law simmered more quietly. Large-scale witch hunts were rare. The act was more of a shadow we see in the statute books from time to time than a fire in the streets. There really is not the mobs of people that are chasing down witches everywhere. That is, until King James' reign. That changed everything. James' harrowing voyage to Denmark in 1589, paired with a fragile sense of his own security forged by a turbulent childhood, became the spark. When he stepped back onto Scottish soil in 1590 with his new queen, Anne of Denmark, by his side, whispers were already spreading. A sinister conspiracy was afoot, they said. Witches had woven dark spells to drown the king and his bride beneath the furious waves of the North Sea. But for James, this wasn't just rumor. It was personal. Some 20 miles east of Edinburgh, along the Firth of Forth, lies a coastal town named North Berwick. And yes, that is going to be the last time I pronounce this in the Scottish way. My Scottish friends can choose to be mad at me. That's fine. I'm going to pronounce it like myself, which is my muddled accent. Yeah, I read your comments. But North Berwick is a small fishing town, with the quaint stone cottages that are buffeted by the winds coming in from the harbor. It's an unlikely place for a national crisis. Yet, in November 1590, it became ground zero. The trouble began with a young servant girl named Gillis Duncan. Now, Gillis lived a quiet life in the nearby village of Trennet. And Gillis was employed by a really kind of nasty piece of work by the name of David Seaton. And he was the deputy bailiff of the little village. And he was a staunch Calvinist. He wasn't a pastor. He wasn't a theologian. He was simply one of these folks who was always on the lookout for the boogeyman. And he was, we must say, thoroughly obsessed with Gillis. In fact, a lot of historians stop short of this. I won't. I think he's a creep. I think what he's doing towards her is essentially stalking her and using some sort of inappropriate fascination with Gillis to enact his sort of twistedness. You see, Gillis was a girl of humble origins and humble means, probably no older than 16. And she had a reputation of slipping out under the cover of night. Heaven forbid 16-year-olds act like themselves. Whispers followed, and tales of her uncanny knack for healing the sick, easing fevers with herbs, and gathering things from around the surrounding woods to help, started to mount a case, at least in Seaton's mind, that he was dealing with a witch. Again, he was obsessed with her. He felt it was his duty to know where she was at all times, where she was going off to at night, and he, as deputy bailiff, had the power and the zeal to figure this out himself. Whatever she was up to, Seaton knew it was sinister. So around mid-November in 1590, he decided to take matters into his own hands. In a dank cellar, cold, stone-walled beneath his own home, Seaton subjected Gillis to the thumbscrews, a brutal device of iron that clamps down on her fingers, crushing bone and sinew with each twist. He also used the witch's bridle, which is this iron muzzle that also pierces the mouth. Under this torment, Gillis broke and confessed to all sorts of things. Now, a quick note on torture, not the thing I thought I would be talking about, but here we are. In no circumstances ever is it the case that torture ever reveals some hidden truth. I know we see that all the time in movies and shows. That doesn't happen in real life. It doesn't happen in history. If you don't believe me, just see interviews with CIA operatives, and they reveal this over and over. If you torture people, you tend, usually, to break their mind entirely, and then the information you get is entirely worthless. Torture does nothing. So all that's happened to Gillis at this point, or to any of the other witches that are to be tortured to have a confession, is nothing more than that, a false confession. But she confessed, coerced and trembling, spilling forth all of this information that she did not do. Gillis admitted to being a witch, claimed that she had danced with the devil himself. Seton, though, was not happy with that answer. He pressed harder. And Gillis, with Seton's promptings, we might add, started to imply that others in the area were part of this coven of witches. She mentioned someone by the name of Agnes Sampson, a midwife from Haddington, and John Fian, who was a schoolmaster from another village, and a web of others across East Lothian. Her words, wrung from agony, set off a chain reaction that would blaze through Scotland like wildfire, pulling King James himself into the fray and marking North Berwick as the epicenter of a growing storm of witches. Okay, so now in the 1590s, King James is getting involved. In fact, he's very much involved in almost every witch trial that he can get his hands on. During one chilling session in Holyrood, within the Privy Chamber, Agnes Sampson, the person whose name was given out before by Gillis, was facing the king herself. Worn down by torture, her tongue still scarred from the witch's bridle, she whispered the words that stopped James cold. You see, James had not let up on the fact that he felt that someone had tried to assassinate him and his queen, Anne. And here, under torture, James alleges that Agnes leaned in and recounted a private exchange that he had with Anne on their wedding night, back in 1589 in Denmark. It was a tender moment James felt had been whispered away from prying ears. Now, this story, we have no idea what to make of it. James says this. You have two choices. Either James is lying, and he's using the story to further push his justification of torture and execution, or somehow someone told Agnes what to say. I guess the third option could be she is a witch and she has preternatural knowledge of this story. I'm just not going with that one. But for James, when Agnes said this, no one else could have known it. And for James, that was no trick. It was the proof that he needed of the diabolical power within Scotland. Convinced of her guilt, he had her declared a witch on the spot, and her fate was sealed. She was strangled and then burned on Castle Hill, January 28th, 1591. And then her ashes were thrown over the edge of the cliff of Edinburgh Castle. And Agnes wasn't the only one. John Fian, the schoolmaster we mentioned earlier, and he was hauled into prison. And there he faced the boots, another torture device. This time where iron wedges were driven between wooden planks to crush the legs into a pulp. And under this torment, on the day after Christmas no less, he confessed to leading the witches in a pact with Satan, orchestrating the North Berwick coven's rituals. And he testified their intent was to drown James in the storms using a spell conjured from the devil's playbook. From there, the witch trials just exploded, and exact numbers are a blur in the fog of history. But the outcome was clear. Many, many dozens were burned to death on Castle Hill, strangled by the hangman's rope, then burned at the stake, and the pyres lighting up Edinburgh's night sky throughout 1591. The North Berwick witch trials didn't quench James VI's obsession with the supernatural. They actually stoked it into a roaring blaze. By 1597, 7 years after the fires of Castle Hill had died down, James channeled his fears into one lasting legacy. In 1597, James wrote his book, Daemonologie. But it's not what you think. It's less Dungeons and Dragons and more James justifying and explaining the witch trials in Scotland. And again, I remind you, no other monarch in the history of the West dared write such a book. Many of them didn't write books anyway, but what they did, they would write it on politics or the faith or something. But this was written by not only a king, but a very well-educated one. And so the book, Daemonologie, is cast as a Socratic dialogue between two fictional characters, Philomathus, a curious skeptic or a lover of learning, as his name says, an epistomen, a fervent believer. Now, this is hardly new in theology or philosophy or anything else. It's not even that new in royal propaganda. But to make this about demons and witches, that is altogether new. You see, James, now 31, steeped in his Protestantism, argued that witches were no myth. They forged pacts with the devil, committed high treason against God, that's the important point that he argued, which is a crime that is a capital crime, deserving death. And he anchored his book in Exodus 22:18, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." Now, anyone who's read the Bible has read that verse. They know what it means. What James is doing here, though, is giving a particular cast or a particular style to what a witch is. The book is about 80 pages, and it unfolds into 3 little short parts. The first probes magic and necromancy, tracing their dark arts to ancient grimoires located in abandoned castles all throughout Europe. The second unpacks witchcraft and sorcery itself and gives detailed instructions on how the pacts are sealed with Satan's mark and other types of lurid stories. And then the third and final part of the book explores the nomenclature and the existence of spirits and specters, from ghostly apparitions to full-on demonic possessions. What's interesting about the book is James doesn't shy away from the lurid. Witches, he claimed, were able to raise storms and sink ships. They could shapeshift, turn into wolves under the moonlight. And they even aided the devil in his, let's just call it, seductions of women. And they even reanimated corpses in order to enact their own carnal desires there. You see, Daemonologie is not a scholar's book. It's a royal rallying cry aimed squarely at silencing doubters. And there were doubters. Famously, Reginald Scot, 1584, wrote The Discovery of Witches, which was printed in London. And this book dismissed witchcraft as trickery and other things designed to distort the mind. In other words, it was more like a magic trick than an orgy of witches and blood. James, though, was incensed, and he actually ordered that Scott's book be burned in 1597. On those same streets in Edinburgh, on High Street, where those previous witches had burned, now burned the book that raised questions about witchcraft in the first place. So Daemonologie bears James' intellectual and paranoia at the same time in equal measures. It's not a very good book either in the end. Trust me, I've spent a lot of time on James. He actually is very, very good when he's dealing with politics. When he's dealing with witches, he's crazy. I'll just say it. He's lost his mind. And he leans heavily into the tortured confessions of Agnes, Sampson, and John Fian. Not hard evidence. He's essentially recounting made-up stories drawn out only under torture. In other words, Daemonologie is inciting a fear that doesn't actually exist. James did inspire, though, one major idea. It literally is the source of how we, today, view witches ever since. See, this is the ironic twist. James, by trying to describe witches, actually created out of full cloth the very concept of what you and I consider to be a witch in the first place. You see, when James came to the throne of England, now James I in 1603, his book crossed the Tweed and inspired William Shakespeare, I've already mentioned it, with the toil and trouble, cauldron bubbling kind of concept. 1606, it's staged in London's Globe Theatre. And the play has Scottish witches right front and center, brewing potions and giving stormy omens. And this was a theatrical tribute to the king's wrath against the witches. And yet, ever since, the very idea of a witch itself, though it has evolved a little with new little wrinkles and flying brooms and things added after the fact, all of it is really intact here in the 1600s. You see, those images in James' mind as he lay awake at night at Scotland, those fantasy witches, are in part what you and I consider to be witches ever since. The North Berwick trials were just the beginning. Between the 1590s and the mid-18th century, an estimated 4,000 to 6,000 people, and mostly women from the lowlands, were tried for witchcraft in Scotland. This is not some fear of superstition, obviously. There is a lot going on here. But that rate in Scotland is far, far higher than almost any other country in Europe at the time. England, for example, this is a hard way to say it, only, quote unquote, only executed about 1,000 witches over those same centuries. So you see Scotland is outpacing people by a factor of 4 or 6 times. What's interesting is by the end of his life, as he grew older, James himself grew more skeptical, especially after becoming King of England, where witch hunts were less common. Still, though, it was not until 1736 when the Witchcraft Act was finally repealed. But Scotland's witch hunts, and James's book on demonology, left a scar and set the precedent for centuries.